Good evening, everybody. The Barbados Museum and Historical Society, the Barbados National Art Gallery, and AICA Southern Caribbean are pleased to have you join us for this special lecture by Professor Cameron McCarthy titled The Work of Art in the Postcolonial Imagination, Notes Towards Globalizing Curriculum and Aesthetics. My name is Natalie, and I will be your MC tonight. I will also remind everyone, as per our flyer, that tonight's proceedings are being video recorded and will be able to be accessed on the Barbados National Art Gallery's website in the coming weeks. I would now like to invite the director of the Barbados Museum, who is also the chair of the Barbados National Art Gallery Board and on the executive board of AICA Southern Caribbean, Alessandra Cummings, to share welcome remarks.
Thank you very much, Natalie, and good evening to everyone. It's with great anticipation and pleasure that we gather here today for a special lecture entitled The Work of Art in the Postcolonial Imagination, Notes Towards Globalizing Curriculum and Aesthetics, and especially a great pleasure to welcome you, Professor Emeritus Cameron McCarthy. This event, in partnership with the Barbados National Art Gallery and AICA Southern Caribbean, holds significant importance for all of our institutions and organizations. And we are very pleased to welcome this audience to hear Cameron McCarthy speak. Professor McCarthy's research, as demonstrated through this lecture, delves into the profound relevance of postcolonial art in shaping our understanding of modern challenges, especially in the context of post-pandemic life and educational frameworks. He has published widely on topics relating to globalization, canon formation, race, and the class conquest of the city, postcolonialism, problems with neo-Marxist writings on race and education, and I could go on, but I will leave it there for the time being. But as we navigate a world transformed by global events, his insights into the theoretical and philosophical dimensions of postcolonial art offer valuable perspectives for both academia and cultural institutions such as ours. The exploration of postcolonial art as a precursor to theory and criticism opens avenues for critical inquiry, challenging conventional narratives and broadening our appreciation of diverse cultural expressions. Professor McCarthy's examination of the postcolonial exemplars from the global south and the periphery of the metropole promises to enrich our perspectives and inspire deeper engagement with artistic legacies that transcend geopolitical boundaries. We look forward to a thought-provoking discussion that resonates with our commitment to fostering dialogue, diversity, and intellectual growth within our community and beyond. Welcome once again, and thank you for joining us in this exploration of art, culture, and postcolonial imaginaries. So, welcome.
I'll be brief, I promise, but I have the distinct pleasure of introducing our esteemed speaker this evening. Professor Cameron McCarthy is Communications Scholar and University Scholar in the Department of Educational Policy, Leadership and Organization, and in the Institute of Communications Research at the University of Illinois at Urbana-Champaign. Professor McCarthy teaches courses in globalization studies, postcolonialism, mass communications theory, and cultural studies at the University of Illinois. He's published widely on topics related to globalization, canon formation, race, and the class conquest of the city, postcolonialism, problems with neo-Marxist writings on race and education, institutional support for teaching, and school ritual and adolescent identities in many international journals. He was one of the lead investigators of the Elite Schools in Globalizing Circumstances global ethnography study of youth and education in 9 countries and across 5 continents: Australia, Africa, India, Europe, and Latin America and the Caribbean. Professor McCarthy is the holder of the Duke of the Edinburgh Gold Award. Please join me in welcoming Professor McCarthy to the podium.
I guess I was ready to start before my time, but here I come. I first want to acknowledge the presence of the McCarthy family in great numbers. Was the ability to overwhelm the hall, as small as it is. I want to thank Director Cummins. Am I being heard well? Sometimes I feel I don't need the mic, but I'm using the mic. Hopefully this works well. I'd like to thank Director Cummins for inviting me to do this talk. It goes as well with a paper that I have written called Burnished Ornamentalism, which is related to my research on elite schools in globalizing circumstances, in which we were looking at the way in which schools constructed during the high point of British colonialism were now preparing students for globalization in a context of new transnational markets. The arrival of international baccalaureate schools, schools like the Mercedes-Benz International School of India, are extraordinary competitors. And the question was, what are these schools doing in relation to gaining student recruitment and the like? I want, before I get into my talk, to acknowledge, well, the great presence of the great Convomerians that are in the house. This is not a bias, it's just what it is. I want to acknowledge that I am the great beneficiary of 3 remarkable institutions in this country. The first one is Commerce School, where I first learned to read text and to read text closely. And that would serve as the underpinning of my methodological approach throughout my entire career, taking classes with Carl Wade and Mr. Waterman, Jenny Jemmett, and others. Secondly, I feel I owe a profound debt to the Barbados Union of Teachers. It is in the Barbados Union of Teachers that I got to understand that teaching was a form of labor. It was a form of intellectual labor, and that one had to think about the pedagogical and the syndical always together. And the third institution, which I think is remarkable, and we do not credit these institutions enough, is the University of the West Indies. For the place where now I want to begin, and if I could ask my colleagues in the back to project my handwritten essay written in 1978. That is what here it is. And I think I need this apparatus. Because I want to talk about this and read it closely. This is an essay I wrote in 1978. Are you hearing me? This thing is working. I was a 22-year-old, and I find myself returning to these themes about aesthetics. Aesthetics not understood as the work work of maverick individuals, but aesthetics concerned with the social imagination. Art turned on to the problems of the people. And so this essay is interesting. It's a handwritten essay, so it tells you of my ancients, how old I am. It was written in 1978 when it was tolerated to submit a paper written in hand. But what does the paper say? It's on tradition of the Caribbean writer. Each generation, and I'm quoting from Frantz Fanon, each generation must, out of relative obscurity, discover its mission, fulfill it, or betray it. The second quote is from the Nigerian novelist Chinua Achebe. Art for art's sake is just another piece of deodorized dog shit. So we're dealing with an understanding of art as applied to human circumstances. In the essay, I go on to say, by tradition, I mean all those things, persons, events, habits, customs, gods, devils, heroes, villains, sculpture, poetry, art, landscape, the totality of experience, past and present, a Caribbean writer has available to him, and which can influence profoundly the direction of his art. And I will stop with the quotation at this point and go back to my presentation. I'm pretty busy here. Put this in here. This is the 5th lecture that I will be given after my retirement. The light is really sharp in my eyes. If something could be done. The first one I gave at UCL in London, 2 I gave in Chile, 1 at my University of Illinois, and they're all tending to deal with the question of aesthetics in a way to flesh out an ethnographic understanding of what is happening with globalization and how these pressures are working on to the educational system, working on to classroom practice, abrogating teachers' autonomy in fundamental ways. So I find myself returning to these concerns here, and now I want our colleagues in the back to start to roll the PowerPoint that is in a loop for tonight, because it is these materials that I'm saying are the containers of a critical humanism that is now despised, now discarded. And I want, in some fundamental way, to bring into the educational curriculum equation. I participated in the founding of the first doctoral program in global studies in education in the world. It was founded at the University of Illinois. And in that program, I teach and have taught courses built around paintings, these paintings that provide a space for thoughtful engagement with contemporary life. And I see them as a sort of what I call ethnographic density. Edward Said refers to the novel as a work of ethnographic intention, geographic intention. I'm thinking on that plane, because in Joseph Conrad's Heart of Darkness, the people of the Congo get to say 4 words. Oh, Mr. Kurtz, he dead. I'm seeing this work as in a consistent reply to these set of circumstances. I do not think, says George Lamming, I do not think there has been anything in human history quite like the meeting of Africa, Asia, and Europe in this American archipelago we call the Caribbean. George Lamming, Coming Home, Conversations 2. Derek Walcott, from What Twilight Says, the future of Caribbean militancy lies in art. For me, and I begin with a rumination, for me, writing has always been in the form of what the Spanish speakers call a borrador, a draft. That is to say that sometimes you discover the questions you really want to address after writing, after the fact, so to speak. So questions methodologically, for me, in qualitative research, are always a sort of framing or shaping device. They change along the way as the terrain for discovery comes into view. They are never about final answers. I think this is what Tom Bolstorff is saying about the strength of open-ended and repeated questioning in qualitative research in his ethnography and virtual worlds. This is also what cultural studies theorists like Stuart Hall, the great Jamaican emigre to Britain and helped found the methodological field of cultural studies, see as methodologically sound, what Hall calls the long soap. The point is, you can't read off human behavior, human practices, the trajectory of particular histories, what Gayatri Spivak, Stuart Hall, C.L.R. James, and Eric Williams call the work of history, axiomatically from a singular theoretical text, or perspective, or calculus, as one might have done in more orthodox forms of Marxism or neo-Marxism, Bowles and Gintis, Capitalism and Schooling as an example. Reading culture from the abstract register of the mode of production as epiphenomena. That is, culture, ideology, and language receive their power from the economic base. And we want to argue, and the postcolonial theorists are arguing, that in fact they are autonomous and that we have to look at them very specifically to understand the mechanics of how they work. This indeed is where postcolonial theorizing enters, thinking of the course and patterns of relations in human societies and in the transnational order from precisely those places left over in Marxism. The epiphenomena of culture, ideology, language, and so forth. This is the kind of provocation to re-examine center-periphery relations. And this, when I talk about the post, I'm not talking about chronologically what is after. I'm talking about an effort to read how power operates, how it operates in center-periphery relations, and the fact that cultural form in the third world is not a bastardized text of the first, that it has its own energies, it has its own explanation, it has its own moral commitments. To question the starting points then, this kind of provocation to re-examine center-periphery relations that pertain to first world, third world transactions, to question the starting points of modernization theory as it was foisted onto Latin America and the Caribbean in the 60s and 70s. A great book to read here is Nils Gilman's Mandarins of the Future, because Gilman is saying, at the time that modernization theory is being foisted onto the global South, America is ripping itself apart. The civil rights movement, it has not gained its own modernization, yet it presents itself as a model to the world. It had one of its critical articulations in works such as Ariel Dorfman and Armand Matalart's How to Read Donald Duck, a critique of Disney comics that had implications for thinking about the role of cultural and aesthetic form in transacting North-South relations. How to Read Donald Duck was indeed part of wider work of cultural and economic analysis in which intellectuals such as Raúl Prebisch, Teotonio dos Santos, Andre Gunder Frank, and in the Caribbean, George Beckford, Persistent Poverty, Walter Rodney, How Europe Underdeveloped Africa, and others, and the members of the Dependista or dependency theory group of economists associated with the United Nations Economic Commission for Latin America and the Caribbean, ECLAC, sought to advance critical thinking on center-periphery relations. These dependency scholars had insisted that underdevelopment was not an original state of affairs, that underdevelopment was an effect of development. That is, development produced underdevelopment, paradoxically. My talk today on thinking about postcolonial art and aesthetics as a way out is inspired by this momentum in the dependista or dependency tradition, this effort to read against the grain. It began as a rumination on canon versus multiculturalism and cancel culture debates that I had published in the Oxford Encyclopedia of Curriculum Studies a couple years ago. In it, I was asserting that the customary opposition between canon formation and multiculturalism, between first world and third world letters and art, is illegitimate. It is the point that the Mexican poet Octavio Paz is making in his Nobel Prize speech of 1990, La búsqueda del presente, in search of the present. A veces, says Paz, nuestras literaturas han sido la negación de las literaturas de Europa. Más a menudo han sido una respuesta. At times, says Paz, our literatures have been the negation of the literatures of Europe. More often, though, they have been a reply. Now, since the COVID pandemic, and I was getting calls from my sister Serling about the challenges of going online all of a sudden to teach, as well as my students who were in teacher education were talking about the same thing. And the students that I had online who were teachers were talking about this moment. Now, since the COVID pandemic, I have arrived at an urgent set of questions for which I feel a rumination on postcolonial art is absolutely necessary. I'm trying to put the work coming out of this reason into a global as a part of a global statement, as part of a global problem, as part of a new universalism. These questions have to do with the struggle, quite literally, for the soul of education, as Tom Pokowitz puts it in his book by the same name. Because with the pandemic, we as educators, particularly in schools, are going through a living plague. As our intellectual labor, the labor conditions of teaching and education come under a new identity defined by neoliberalism. This suffusing of education with the weight of society's troubles has a long history. And the most powerful current turn, actually, has come via neoliberalization of education that began at least from the 80s. In the US, the so-called charter movement, the effort to privatize schools, voucher programs, you give poor people money so that they can choose schools. Often these folks would choose private schools, even though there's no demonstration of better results for their kids. And so on, a movement intended to decapitate union organization and the leadership of the teaching community, to undermine public education, public health, and to put public anything else up for sale. We can see its effects on the organization of knowledge in schooling and in the university. This can be summarized after Camus in one word: invasion. As new exogenous systems imperatives, new instrumental imperatives linked to neoliberalism, STEM, nativistic, and feral nationalisms, the anti-immigration stuff in the United States, are being foisted onto the arena of education, abrogating the intellectual autonomy of educators as models of thoughtfulness. Neil Postman, in some ways, was an early town crier on this in books such as Amusing Ourselves to Death, Teaching as a Conserving Activity. I remember when I was in the Barbados Union, we were reading his version of teaching as a subversive activity, in which he warned about the supplanting of critical thinking in the classroom. We are now living in an educational context not too dissimilar from that described by Albert Camus in La Peste, the plague, regarding the seaside town of Oran in Algeria after the bubonic plague struck sometime in the early part of the last century. From the moment, says the narrator of La Peste, from the moment the plague had closed the gates of the city, they had lived solely within their separation. They had been cut off from the human warmth that makes you forget everything else. It is in this context that a virtual war over science, the so-called culture wars, as my good friend Michael Olnick calls these developments in his new book by the same name, the very struggle over the iconography of the present, that is, what's important, what should be supported, what should be funded, what should we do about contemporary crises. And this is always in the form of a selection. This is always a game of winners and losers. The very struggle over the iconography of the present is proceeding full scale as a corollary to the competition over scarce resources and their disposition and distribution in schooling. So I'm saying it's not just a matter of people shooting off hot air about what matters to them, how important they are, what identities they have. It is also about who gets what, when, and how, which classes benefit in this scramble of the present moment. In this context, then, why art? Why post-colonial art? And as Tina Turner might say, what has art got to do with it? What theoretical purchase in the field of curriculum studies and global studies in education might such art provide or permit? I believe in this matter, post-colonial art comes to us as a great potential intellectual and pedagogical help, to speak somewhat in the voice of Matthew Arnold in Culture and Anarchy. Because these aesthetic forms and practices are containers of critical humanism now despised, and in some cases violently banished from schooling on many fronts. By critical humanism, I'm not talking about some happy navigation of difference, the curriculum as some kind of human relations program that seeks to resolve problems of diversity and difference. The specific promise of post-colonial art is, for me, as a way out of intellectual constraint, in the sense that Michel Foucault suggests Immanuel Kant's appeal, aude sapere, dare to know, sought to push back on superstition. We're living in a time, with the aid of digitalization, of superstitions. Superstitions about immigrants, anti-vax, all of these hover around our educational process. And sought to push back on superstition and open up options for grappling with difficult problems in the life world. It is in this art that one often finds criticism, agonism, and optimism operating in the same discursive space. And I'd like my colleagues to foreground Terra Nullius by Gordon Bennett, and I will talk about it in a little while. It's called Terra Nullius. Yeah, that one. And turn on this thing. It goes green. So, as I said, we're talking about art, post-colonial art, as a container of critical humanism. And that in the same space where there is negation, critical negation, there is also optimism. That we have to think these processes together. And here we are. We are in the wild waste of colonialism somewhere in Australia. In a clearing, bracketed by the Union Jack on one side, and in it, the arraignment of British troops asserting the doctrine of terra nullius. That is, nobody was there, we arrived, there's no organized society, there is no kind of civil structures. Could we go back to the one that we had before? I can't remember the number, but that's it. And therefore we claim it. We claim the land. We claim it in. I claim this land in the name of His Majesty King George III. But right above that scenario, we see the steps. We see the steps of the native subjects, the Aboriginal subjects in Australia, rising to the sun, suggesting that they cannot be finally conquered. Their cultural form will always be part of whatever the equation is. That is what I'm interested in foregrounding. I'm finding this challenging. I'm getting a workout. I went swimming today. That might have destabilized me a little bit. What counts for postcolonial art is not place-bound, but exists in the in-between spaces between the first world and the third, as a corridor or a doorway between modernity and anti-modernity. The French critic Bruno Latour says, "We were never modern. That modernization is a discourse read out of the human threads of connection, of hybridity, as a kind of purity." Between and across genres and disciplines, and enters full bodily into the most combustible elements of Europe's encounter with Asia, Africa, the Americas, and the Caribbean. The Puerto Rican painter Arnaldo Roche Rabel, and I'm just asking my colleagues to be prepared for showing Poor Devil, enters into this zone of discarded but difficult conversations in painting in his Poor Devil. I don't remember the number, but if you can find it, I would really appreciate it. That features the birth of a new world, of a new world genus, a black Creole Venus, a cut and paste subject, a polyglot figure of Europe and Africa and the native world. And let me talk a little bit more about this. Thank you very much. Okay, all right. And here we are, this painting by Roche Rabel called Poor Devil. This area, including all the way to the United States, is deeply incestuous. Yet we live in the terms of extraordinary disavowal. What Roche Rabel is pointing towards is in fact the suppression of the African presence in the world. This is not Botticelli's Venus, although there's an allusion to that. This is a subject born in the wilds of the Caribbean, of the Americas, with an unresolved issue of what is the status of our Africanness in this region. And it is presented to us as a kind of agony. A black, an African figure with blue eyes. Hybrid figure gestating from the wild, suggesting an inchoate, unsettled, problematic set of circumstances. And again, it is, before my paper gets blown away, again, it is a situation in which I think the difficult conversations are being provoked in the artistic work. Like the Haitian novelist Jacques Roumain in The Masters of the Dew, the questions are difficult, and the process towards answers is a sweet and bitter agony. We Calibans are of such stuff our dreams have made on, and our little life is wronged with asleep. Who are we? We, the descendants of Africa, Europe, Asia, and the native in the New World, that occupy this agonistic geography and history. Occupy this agonistic geography haunted by history. Like, I can still think of doing the research in these schools where a school is built on a plantation. There's absolutely no discussion as to its historical past. In the case of South Africa, they thought of building a museum on campus, the school campus, and discovered the shackles of slaves below. These were not African slaves, they were slaves from Indonesia. And so this is the sort of issues that we're trying to bring to the forefront, and that I find these paintings, this writing, brings to our attention. The methodological turn towards treating these questions relationally and dynamically of rereading center-periphery relations is also found in the work of Edward Said's Orientalism, Reading Between Egypt and France, and Eric Williams's British Historians and the West Indies, unpacking the authority of British historiography on the Caribbean and reading back onto the eye of power in the organization of knowledge itself. That is contesting how history is written and how our subjectivities are cast in that history. And Edward Said would acknowledge in one of his lectures the important debt that he owed to Williams, to C.L.R. James, for that thought. When Williams had written British Historians in the West Indies, and she said he had written when his population was distracting itself at Carnival. When he had written that book, Edward Said had not written Orientalism. So it's a reasonable kind of recognition that Said makes. It is found in Gayatri Spivak's notion of worlding in her 3 women's texts on imperialism. Spivak evaluates Charlotte Bronte's Jane Eyre via the Dominican Creole writer Jane Reese's White Sargasso Sea. Spivak, after Reese, gives life and history to Mad Mrs. Rochester's Bertha Mason, whose past in Jane Eyre is told through Mr. Rochester's perspective. So Reese is, from the post-colonial setting, rewriting the novel to put into subjectivity and concentrated attention the life of the Creole white woman who was born and grew up on the plantation in Jamaica. This suggests methodologically what C.L.R. James achieves in The Black Jacobins, his extraordinary book on the Haitian Revolution, in which he creatively reads back and forth between Paris and Port-au-Prince, between the texts of the philosophes. Voltaire said, the Frenchman rails against injustice, eats his dinner, and goes to bed, and others, and the revolutionary language of ex-slaves by Toussaint Louverture, demanding their freedom, reading between the French Revolution and the Haitian Revolution. Lisa Lowe's The Intimacies of Four Continents, that documents the links between Africa, Asia, Europe, and the New World natives in the building out of both imperialism and the canons of liberalism, also comes to mind. That is, liberalism, philosophy, is materially supported and made available, and the whole emergence of the middle class subjectivity by the processes of expropriation in Asia and Africa and the Caribbean and places in the global South. That connection is important to underscore. That philosophy, liberalism, doesn't exist from sort of the endogenous intentions of thinking men in Europe, but that there is a nexus that is rooted in expropriation in the Third World. Or in another scenario, the great dialogue between black writers and artists and Spain around and just after the Spanish Civil War. The Spanish Civil War is very interesting in the sense that in the Civil War, there's something called the Abraham Lincoln Brigade that is sent from the United States to Spain to fight on the side of the Republicans, to fight against the fascism of Franco. And in that group, many black people went to fight for the cause of liberty. And in that situation, many of them performed roles of leaders of their particular companies in ways that they could not perform for the American army in the context of the Second World War. It is an extraordinary period. Indeed, here too, we must mention the extraordinary black women artists like Nina Simone, Josephine Baker, who fled the United States, finding a more generous reception and realization of their artistic endeavors in Europe and Latin America. A great example is Elizabeth Catlett, black feminist sculptor and painter whose US citizenship was revoked because she joined the Communist Party in Mexico in the 1940s. Paul Robeson's passport was taken away because of his sympathies for the USSR. She, like many US intellectuals fleeing the US in search of meaning in the global South, Jack and Irene Delano and their photography and silk screen work in Puerto Rico in the 40s comes to mind. Also my great colleague, now retired at Colgate University in New York, Jay Mandel, fled conscription in the Vietnam War, for the Caribbean, worked at the University of West Indies in Jamaica as one of those economists who was engaged in the sort of dependency theory reading that I refer to, came under the influence of Mexico City's Taller de Gráfica Popular, the People's Graphics Arts Workshop, where many American radical and innovative artists, such as the Japanese-American Ruth Asawa, were trained during and after the Second World War. Indeed, Catlett, who died a few years ago in Mexico City at 96, asserts, quote, "I'm inspired by Black people and Mexican people, my two peoples." In Richard Wright's Pagan Spain, Wright enters Spain from France in a car, and he drives down from the north all the way south, and he's commenting on culture and life in Spain. He articulates the call of a world that is full of ritual and contradiction, and that allows for him an imaginary alternative to the Puritanism in the US. Or Miles Davis's Sketches of Spain, in which Davis absorbs the flamenco-inspired music of the blind Spanish composer Joaquín Rodrigo's Concierto de Aranjuez, and translates this encounter into new directions and modal experiments in jazz. And as a further example, and I'd like my colleagues to be ready with this one, it's The TV Presenter by Gordon Bennett. And as a further example of movement across thousands of miles of geography and ancestry, the dialogue between the Australian Aboriginal painter Gordon Bennett and the Haitian-American painter Jean-Michel Basquiat in Bennett's TV Presenter, in which the Australian Aboriginal painter quotes directly from a 1981 untitled painting of Basquiat, questioning the very meaning of modernization and urbanization, and featuring low-flying planes hovering over skyscrapers in New York City. And I want to, let me hold this here so it doesn't blow away. I want to look at that painting more closely with you, because I'm looking at two paintings, this one and then the one that, I'm looking at two paintings, this one and the one that Gordon Bennett revises and creates. In this painting, painted in 1981, featuring low-flying planes in New York City. What Basquiat is aiming to communicate is his dissatisfaction with the claims of urbanization, with the claims of modernization. The skyscraper representing the sort of final achievement of being modernized. It was the French architect, Le Corbusier, who said we could resolve all modern problems, all problems of city life, with international architecture. The French philosopher Jacques Attali says that art often is prophetic. This is 1981. This is before 9/11. Now, what happens after 9/11 is the explanation of the next painting, which I hope we can show, by Gordon Bennett, which is called TV Presenter. And these two painters are in communication across enormous distances. I'm making the case that art is not bound by cultural exceptionalism, that there is an effort to generate a dialogue across systems. The Australian Aboriginal painter, Gordon Bennett, intensifies that critique of modernization. So now he adds the Statue of Liberty and an ironized presence. He puts on the painting words that problematize the key terms of what is modern: sign, emblem, icon, image, etc. And he puts the television image there almost as a kind of T.S. Eliot hippopotamus, or, you know, the idea of the hippopotamus head stuffed with straw, this sense that there is nonsense that comes out of the machine. Intersperses it with a ball of fire, a ball of Arabic screed. Assalamu alaikum. Peace be with you. The painting is a cry, is an appeal for dialogue across East and West. And it is generated by this dynamic relationship between these two artists. One, Aboriginal, Gordon Bennett is interesting because his mother was Aboriginal, his father is Irish Australian. They hide the fact that he has Aboriginal roots from him until he's 21 or 22, he discovers this. And on discovering this, he goes into a crisis. And in this crisis, he uses art to work out the demons. Prior to this, he's not an artist. It's a fascinating story. And I've seen documentaries of Gordon Bennett where he is in Aboriginal communities, and the white Australian present in that setting is his translator. He cannot speak Aboriginal. He cannot communicate to the community that he is putatively part of. And so his work, I think, represents this kind of agony. I was fortunate in many of my books to be able to use Bennett's images, which he generously allowed me to use on my book covers. But again, it's one of those examples that provides us with the opportunity for substantive thoughtfulness and critical analysis and thinking that I want to encourage. And as I said in my globalization education courses, I would organize my classes around paintings because they allow students a common space, a common theater to enter to discuss ideas. I have been led here unexpectedly via the thinking of the Spanish filmmaker Pedro Almodovar. and his reflections during the pandemic lockdown in Spain. Almodovar kept a diary which he called Viva la Tristeza. Live the sadness, long live the sadness. He was commenting in this diary about, in the lockdown, what was lost from cultural and material life. On this day, there would be Semana Santa celebrations in the street, but they're not there because of the lockdown. And Almodovar went on to prepare a soundtrack. You can find it on Amazon.com or for a film that he never made, entitled also Viva la Tristeza. The latter consists of a compilation of ballads from around the world featuring the remarkable voices of Shirley Horn, Nina Simone, Chavela Vargas, La Llorona, Ana de Me Quedo Contigo, Gregory Isaacs' House of the Rising Sun, and an extraordinary version of the late Prince's Nothing Compares to You by the American jazz singer Jimmy Scott. It is Scott that fascinated me because it is very difficult. It was certainly very difficult for me when I first heard his interpretation of Nothing Compares to You, to determine the sexual identity of the singer of the piece. What I learned about Scott is that he suffered from a genetic disorder called Kallman's syndrome, which has the effect of delaying puberty until adulthood. So for Scott, until well into his adult life, he was a mere 4 feet tall until 35 years of age, whereupon he grew an additional 8 inches. And he had a soprano voice of a child or a woman. He was mercilessly teased and ridiculed throughout his life because of these perceived defects and oddities. I was fascinated by this figure, whose voice I found difficult to classify. Man or woman, girl or boy, and his life story of a kind of exile, not geographically outside his group, but within his putative group of African American subjects. I was particularly haunted by his voice and his life story. It made me think of how we classify, sort, eliminate, and exclude in education. Because sorting and separating and classifying are all at the heart of what educators do. Classification tells us more about ourselves than it does about our student subjects. For as Pierre Bourdieu notes, classification classifies the classifier. This process is often thoughtless regarding the capacities and aspirations of lower class children, of minority school subjects, thoughtless in the way we separate self from other and establish walls and frontiers and border zones, as Saskia Sassen calls them. I believe such classification weighs heavily on postcolonial art and is often discarded status in education. That is, if you go to school, you're not going to see these artistic works. And if you go to a school, you're not even going to see art on the curriculum. And if you go to a public school, it is even going to be more perverse in the US setting. That art, music, accessory, precisely those things I'm arguing are necessary to critique the excesses of modernization and industrialization are shut. They're not part of the curriculum experience. Such classification pushes critical humanistic work, humanistic learning, humanistic art to the perimeter, to the outside of the paradigm of modernization via the neoliberalization of education and the curriculum. Think of all, you might have heard, of all the book banning that goes on in the United States, book burning. You can't teach black history in some schools because it is seen as a kind of too political of an act, and that education is not about politics and so forth. I want to use this occasion to chart a course of reevaluating the work of art in the postcolonial imagination, to get at its ethnographic density, and after Spivak, its structures and motors, its worlding, its treatment of a world of contradiction. Specifically, I am interested in how this density is to be read back onto the eye of power in education itself, its stabilities and certainties, its codification of the known world of things, its stress on practical reason and the technological sublime. I believe, like Edward Said in his essay, Anthropology and its Interlocutors, that postcolonial art constitutes works of ethnographic imagination. They are collectively a reply to how the 19th century novel cast the third world subject as voiceless and lacking diegesis. Ian Watt, in The Rise of the Novel, argues that it is in the novel that the middle-class subject is born, that a Jane Austen Emil rises to being. I seek to read the ethnographic densities in postcolonial art in the following three areas. Its critique of and counter to what I call hegemonic realism, or the ontological claim on the real, what exists, what might be, how the world is ordered. As C.L.R. James would say, fiction is not opposed to reality. Fiction is an extension of reality. But he would also say of Herman Melville's Moby Dick that this is the classic novel of what he calls bureaucratic organization. That wherever Ahab appears in this novel on deck, he's surrounded by the first mate, the second mate, the third mate, the first harpooner, the second harpooner, the third harpooner. In other words, a stratification on deck that registers the social world outside, which is equally stratified. Secondly, I suggest that this work is engaged in double and triple coding. The search for methods of alterity to consecrate new world hybridities, to speak in a different tongue that blends native postcolonial stylistic aspirations with strategic appropriations from the Western aesthetic forms. The Australian Aboriginal artist Gordon Bennett, for example, finds an alliance with Van Gogh in his brushstroke work that invokes both pointillism and perspectival painting. In pieces such as The Outsider, which I'll spare you the going back and forth. And third, the conditional but continuing quest for emancipation, propositions about a new world that is glimpsed, not known finally. In the case of George Lamin's San Cristobal, the imaginary New World island pursued by the polyglot crew on board the Reconnaissance in Natives of My Person, the final arrival never comes. Disputes remain to be settled, and the women in a final excruciating scene of evaluation of their relationship with their men and life's meaning pose the question voiced by the surgeon's wife. Why did we follow them here? Why did we follow them here? To which the lady of the house replies, because we are a future. We are a future that they must learn. Mercifully, I'll bring you to my conclusion. I know I've gone on longer than I planned. All things considered, then, I believe that these works of art foreground a militancy of point of view that rejects the role of the artist as a maverick or distant observer, as in art for art's sake. Here, the postcolonial artist installs himself or herself and his or her work in the very minefield of associative processes of the colonizer-colonizing character and its extended or prolonged aftermath. Ultimately, contemporary art that is postcolonial vigorously places art at the center of the struggle for what C.L.R. James calls happiness in the tumult of globalization in the 21st century. It casts a particular focus on the struggle to sustain possibility and community among the peoples of the global South, but also speaks directly to the fortunes of the diasporic peoples scattered across the peripheries of the developed countries of the North as well. These contradictory, hybrid, and utopic texts agonize about identity and present the future as an open ground of possibility and negotiation. Postcolonial artists critique the authority over knowledge foregrounded in the imperialist canonical text, the English book, as Homi Bhabha calls it, and the hegemonic wish fulfillment of, Homi Bhabha said that the British tongue, the English tongue, was not false, but forked. And the hegemonic wish fulfillment of the political, cultural, and knowledge-producing systems of the West. They instead allow us to glimpse a world of the future conquered by the polyglot voices of the marginalized, oppressed. It is this world that Wilson Harris alerts us to at the end of The Palace of the Peacock. When Dunn and his colonizer and colonizing crew begin the excruciating negotiation and encounter with their submerged others and repressed selves. The crew, says the narrator, was transformed by the awesome spectacle of a voiceless, soundless motion, the purest appearance of vision in the chaos of emotional sense. Earthquake and volcanic water appeared to seize them and stop their ears, dashing scales only from their eyes. They saw the naked, unequivocal, flowing peril and beauty and soul of the pursuer and the pursued, all together. And they knew that they would perish. They knew that they would perish if they dreamed to turn back. And therefore trying, with these preliminary remarks on postcolonial art and aesthetics and their critical purposes, to more deeply problematize the current condition of intellectual labor in schooling as the educational enterprise comes under the excruciating exogenous pressures, overwhelmed by the culture wars and by instrumental imperatives that have the effect of a curtailment of the autonomy of the teacher in the classroom. It is my hope that space can be found both inside and outside the school for these artistic works that are carriers and purveyors of critical humanism, that now, with the endless stretching and extension that can be afforded with digitalization, we can put into productive dialogue the student of a high school in Singapore with one in Barbados, with one in Trinidad or Jamaica or St. Lucia, with one in Chicago, with one in New Orleans or New York, one in Harlem, one in Rio, one in Santiago de Chile, with one in Antigua. There's a brave new world, I'm arguing, waiting to be born in education for post-colonial art, which forswears cultural exceptionalism and narrow-minded affinities that might provide us with a critical way out and a critical way forward in a new convivencia and as tools of conviviality. I thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Professor McCarthy, for that wonderful lecture. We do have some time for a Q&A with the audience, if anybody would like to share any comments, questions.
727.
Thank you very much. It's very nice to hear someone defend a universalist humanism. But I am curious to ask you why you do not, or rather, why do you collapse anti- and post-colonial criticism and art and thought? That's my first question. Because many of the thinkers you refer to, I would certainly classify as of the defiantly anti-colonial tradition.
Mm-hmm.
And yet some of the philosophers you're also referring to, I would call post-humanists, postmodernists.
Yes.
And it's hard for me to somehow fit them into the same kind of agenda. And on a related note, I wanted to ask if you see the post-colonial dilemmas, questions, problems as being the same in, say, metropolitan United States and the Caribbean. Are they the same in the Caribbean as they are in Australia for indigenous communities in Australia? And when Bennett responds to Basquiat, isn't he actually engaging with Basquiat on Basquiat's terms?
Right.
I mean, it's not Basquiat who is engaging with Bennett on Bennett's terms. I don't know if you understand the gist of my question.
That's really interesting because Bennett is engaging with Basquiat after Basquiat is dead. He's died. He's engaging with his work. My point about putting these two sets of people together is to say that this work works across particularism. That you could have a painter in Australia I'm not collapsing at all the circumstances. I'm saying they are in communion, they are in dialogue. That dialogue then is an open space in which conversation can be begun to arrive at new understandings. I'm not a finalist in the way I think about things. I'm more and always more consistently invested in generating the conversation. I feel as an educator That's my commitment. Not to hold aside necessarily, absolutely, although we are responsible for some kind of moral leadership. But, you know, you go into the classroom, it gets, clearly you have responsibilities. But at the same time, you want in that setting for thoughtfulness to occur through conversation. And I believe these artistic works allow us to enter that space, to have that conversation in the most vigorous of ways over the most difficult things. For instance, the Ravel painting, Poor Devil. It's like there's, in my classes, whenever I use that painting, some of the most extraordinary discussions about people's identities and the different kinds of statuses they might have in Kuwait as opposed to in Madagascar or in South Korea, etc. This allowed for an extraordinary kind of conversation in which I saw myself as a facilitator. And I see it as unfortunate that that space doesn't exist and is furthermore is under assault, under attack. And it may be that you are right, your intuition is right, that I am coming from having lived in the United States for 40 years, and therefore I'm deeply impacted by what is happening there. But I do feel that this area in which we live is deeply incestuous, that there are extraordinary connections across our different societies that are denied by political leaders for political purposes to mobilize the worst instincts in people. And that is what I want to confront. And I feel that my theater is the education project, is the classroom. This is where I can be effective. This is where I can allow for the staging of necessary conversation. Your first observation about the possibilities, the fact that I may be collapsing different strands of theories into postcolonialism, I accept, but in the sense that I feel that postcolonial theory, postcolonial criticism, benefits from, draws on things like post-structuralism, from neo-Marxism, from postmodernism, from a wide range of thoughts. And you're likely then to find in any given theoretical position the actual traces of others.
Thank you very much. I'm sure somebody else has a question.
Any other questions or comments from the audience? Okay. Well, I think please join me in giving Professor Cameron McCarthy another round of applause. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much for your generous presence and for putting up with me for an hour and what seemed to be an hour and a half. Thank you.
Wonderful, thank you. And I'll just also thank all the leadership and staff of the museum, the National Art Gallery, AICA Southern Caribbean for organizing this event, and to our tech team and to all of you for coming out tonight and joining us in this conversation. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Oh, my gosh.